Hello everyone, today we talk about the 9th century Carolingian heavy cavalrymen for our historical military units series. We don't do this stuff too often, but I would say that this was one of the most awaited for sort of units that we could cover. Naturally, it's a big topic, and I realized that while having made enough videos about sort of Frankish history as a whole, as far as the Frankish army, in particular the Carolingian one, considering its absolute and relative importance in history, we haven't really that much. Admittedly, I already prepared something for the campaigns series. We'll come back on Carolingian warfare more frequently, I think, in the future. This is in part due to what happened in the past years due to the randomized sort of cycle extraction as far as the topics are concerned. But there is not just a way to fix this now with specials, but there is also just a payback, because what doesn't come before comes later, as a matter of fact. And so you understand also here, you know how the historical military unit series works. You have a stereotypical concept, like why should this be the 9th century and say, I don't know, the second half or the entirety of the 8th, all right? What about the 10th century? There are, by the way, fairly slight changes in the panoply, because this is mostly what we discussed, but not entirely, of a Western heavy cavalryman during a period like the High Middle Ages, right? When you look at 13th century knights, you realize that, after all, their basic gear did not radically differ from the one of half of a millennium before. And this is true essentially for other peoples out there. We made videos about knights, about here I use the term cavalrymen because to a certain degree of these were actual knights. There was actual militaries. There was a very heavily knightly and chivalric mentality that dates back to the millennia, so we could call them knights. But there is a slight sort of approximation focusing on the idea that knighthood, as we more typically know it through modern historiography, is something that cements itself slightly later. There is also an argument to be made, and we will see it better, that while cavalry was actually the stronger arm at this point in the Western art of war, still infantry had its own saying, and at some point the Carolingian heavy cavalrymen get beaten by, for example, look at Saxon infantry at Zuntal. That was not just one of the few Carolingian defeats overall, but also practically the only tactically reconstructible battle of the entire Carolingian era. Meaning that this is not an exaggeration, literally we don't have, for the times, not say information about battles. There is plenty of that. There is also some sort of important archaeological background, obviously, but I don't think that is even that vast. But let's say when it gets to the only type of source that can de facto tell us what happened in a battle, namely the narrative ones, chronicles do not really discuss this very much. And there are some paradoxes that are really interesting, because, as you know, Carolingian society is very military and aristocratic in many ways. I already made videos about the army of Charlemagne, about sort of other aspects of its organization, so we're not completely new to the topic. You know, the controversies and the oceans of ink spilled on the subject, perhaps, and truly in an excessive way, meaning that even trying to guess the size of the Carolingian army, or there are different schools, let's say, they want to explain to you how it was more like according to this model, and more like this others. The only way to, we've seen it also in the video about the response to kings and generals regarding the birth of feudalism and so on. The best way is not to the structure, but to syncretically measure, like probably to measure the pulse of this art of war. Is very intense and gives you, after all, a pretty large amount of scale, right? A lot of information regarding probably the magnitude of probably the efforts carried out in massive operations, like, I don't know, the conquest of the Longobard kingdom, the destruction of the Avar Khaganate, these things were pretty darn big. And in fact, one of the most underrated aspects of the Carolingian army was its logistical organization. It was something really extraordinary, to say the least. But we'll talk more about the art of war per se. Today, we stick to the guy, right? And in order to do so, of course, we'll rely on partly iconographic, partly archaeological sources, but also on the general sort of context and background, what we know about the development of the art of war, where the Carolingian heavy cavalryman was really at the center of it all, right? It is true, as we were pointing out before, that not just cavalry was still importantly vulnerable to infantry at this point, but that this could be true in particular when it was these heavy cavalrymen dismounting to constitute the foot proper. This is something you can appreciate at many different times, in fact also later knightly history. We're talking also a pretty big scenario, but as we were saying before, as a theater in general, the extension of the Carolingian Empire, at the same time, again, society was sort of simpler, more homogeneous. There weren't enormous divides across Europe at this point, if not in relation with one another for the time, right? And so when we actually have to assess the absolute role of heavy cavalry, we realize that they were all pretty similar. In fact, this is also a point that I've always used to make on Schwerpunkt, that if you're really trying to seek like some sort of technological distinctions or whatever, like we're completely astray. This is what von Clausewitz teaches us, by the way, very clearly. What manner was moral force that surely was also compounded by material one, because that's how they eventually interact with one another. But if you had to, I don't know, trace the difference between a Carolingian heavy cavalryman and a Longbird one by the time of the Frankish conquest of Italy, is there any significant difference? No, right? Not just also because we don't even have any proof, because there is very few material extant, as you know, with the Christianization of Europe. Basically, we start missing the great part of military material culture, because men were not buried in arms quite anymore. But also because, obviously enough, these countries were practically identical in terms of technological development for what it mattered around this thing. And also social, they were pretty similarly organized. And what I think I remember also from my studies on Carolingian, Longbird warfare, etc., like I always like to point out at university, is the fact that Europe, as we were talking about it just the other day, looking at a slightly later period of the aftermath of Basil II's death, a completely relatively unrelated topic, that the system here across Europe and the Mediterranean was essentially already set for the gradual oligarchization and privatization of the system. So the preconditions of what we eventually call like feudal Europe and feudal civilization are not just very deeply ingrained, especially in north of the Alps, but they are essentially just like the trend that will be followed across the rest of Europe, in great part also thanks to the same Carolingian conquests that do carry out some further military engineering, right? The divides, again, in terms of armies quality, the Carolingians had the strongest army in Western Europe. Like there is no other people in Western Europe had the level of military organization the Carolingians had. Because yes, there were divides within the system. The greater powers essentially in Christian Europe, in Latin Christian Europe, were the Carolingians and the Longobards. That's practically, like the rest were all very particularly fragmented. So these were the only countries that had either a state and or a politically gluing factor. This is especially true for the Franks, that could bring on the table really large amounts, probably like tens of thousands of men in specific operations. But especially the Longobards kingdom was just like, in this sense, other countries like the insular, the continental Saxons did not really have a level of social certification that could provide with such a great amount of it's a matter of wealth distribution, of properly trained heavy cavalrymen, not much for their equipment, and in fact seems to have been identical in material terms, but for the resources required to constantly train at a collective level, at the regional scale, the Carolingian armies, in fact, would employ to conquer the rest of Europe. Right? This is the radical difference. It's fundamentally training and the proclivity towards expansion, an imperial mindset, the capacities to sustain this in a prolonged fashion. What I like to remember is that one of the Frankish annals, like some clergymen, pointed out this year there wasn't a military expedition, meaning that in their mindset it was completely normal for every year to be there military expedition, of multiple ones, right? So I don't want to get entangled in this organizational side of the story, but it's obvious that when we talk about such units, you also have to have any meaningful background that I think, especially about Carolingian warfare, should be fairly clear. Again, I'm horrified by certain things that are uploaded on YouTube, and I will not make any names. We'll skip this entirely. But I give for granted perhaps that the people are familiar with these topics to a sufficient or decent degree. So I choose also the 9th century because it's conventionally the peak of the Carolingian Empire. This could be, there is a level of maturity that affirms itself with the further expansion properly of the empire itself, with new territories that are conquered for good and providing further resources, etc. So this constitutes the peak and also the decline, saying dissolution of the Carolingian Empire, at least as a meaningfully unitary, or at least sort of hierarchically dominated ensemble wall. So let's say that this is the army of the later Charlemagne, right? More or less, the army of sort of Louis the Pious, more or less, this is it. In the 9th century, heavy cavalrymen of the Carolingian era ranked among the highest echelons of the warrior estate, all right? Set apart by the weapons he carried and the superior gear that demanded considerable financial resources to acquire. And there are, as you know, extensive studies to determine exactly how much, again, also for some pseudo-demographic calculation, how many people were involved in the army, how much of this heavy cavalry existed. Let's focus just on the basic concepts here, looking at what this really meant. It is true, it's definitely true that at this point, there is not just a great acceleration towards social inequality fundamentally. You have, for different reasons, especially in the later Carolingian period, and this is still valid as for this episode as a timeline, where for different reasons, these aristocrats become ever more powerful. Many people that were also historically considered free, and in ways that are not always documentable, in the sense that if you look at Alamannia, I mean, who was free? It was a society largely, they had their written codes that are stimulated also probably by the Carolingians, but everything worked mostly on the basis of oral tradition, of clientele connections. And so there wasn't, like, obviously an overarching state that sort of logistically dictated what individual people had to do. This is a broader trend where most people that used also to serve in the army during the Carolingian period are, for different reasons, there is a Frankish pax, so to say, at a point. Like, they're not even properly needed in the expeditions to the same extent they would have been needed before in their pettier kind of feuds at a provincial level and whatever. So there is a level of demilitarization, of disarmament. This is partly imposed, partly actually free, where lots of people lose their liberty de facto. And this especially happens, obviously, among those peoples that were conquered. We've seen this fairly well in some videos about Eastern Francia. We've seen it also for Italy. We have seen it happening within the same core of Frankish society, as a matter of fact. But the importance in the sense of Frankish societal organization is that Gaul is historically that aristocratic. You have this largely preserved latifundium system that fundamentally shrinks, sort of partially fragments, obviously, during late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, but it fundamentally remains intact as far as an aristocratic society is concerned. This was the case also in Visigothic Spain until the Arab conquest, obviously. So the Franks constitute a bit like a unicum, right? Just to make an example, an average proceres of sort of a local lord in Gaul could have more private land than what the Longobard king himself owned, right? In a much more publicly based and urban trade-based society, right? Naturally, the basis of power was the land. So as we said before, these armies, this society looked very much similar, but the degree, right, of power concentrated in fewer hands was staggeringly higher in north of the Alps. There are interesting studies. I don't know, you probably have heard of Wickham. They're a bit too socioeconomically oriented, but they give you an idea of at least what was happening at a lower level that you can compound with sort of more political, traditional history at the moral level above. This is all reflected in symbolism. I made some videos about the Carolingian, Ottonian era dubbing processes, the fact that, of course, the Carolingians were soaked into all the Germanic epos of the older times. Think about the Nibelungenlied. Think about how the same Charlemagne compounded with sort of this mix of Germanic and Jewish sacrality. He was obsessed with David and the Old Testament to the extent of sort of God, Lord of battles, descended among the ranks. So as you know, the Frankish ematophilia and truly imperial Catholic traditional sense of passion, of self-sacrifice, of, properly the cult of blood, right? Also in the probably the veins of the noblemen, of the sacred kings, that for this reason also had spent a great part of their previous history killing one another, except sort of breaking newborn babies' heads on rocks just because they carried the blood of the that would have had to inherit power, like is giving you a pretty distinct and concrete idea of the sheer traumatic brutality of this culture and how people brought up at the top in this sense really were. Made lots of videos about knightly psychology and sort of the general religious military ethos of these peoples. The Franks knew, as I often say, just three things: land, horses, and swords. That's all what their culture exclusively revolved around in a concretely material sense. You can appreciate this also in their diplomatic gifts, right? Sent abroad. Interestingly enough, especially at the age of Charlemagne, they entertained this intercontinental relations. And this is an incredibly beautiful world on its own. We know much of these ideals through the later tradition. Think about the paladins of Charlemagne. I'm preparing a video about that sort of in between myth and history at the same time, because it actually yields a great deal of knowledge that we tend to attribute mostly to some sort of artistic literary sophistication of, say, the 12th century. But this stuff is pretty much in line with what all we know or existed before as well. So it's difficult. The greatest difficulty, as always in history, is trying to get how they would actually live like. But if you understand also their military gear, you can understand the physicality, the mentality, the general approach to a lifestyle was largely spent on horseback, right? And so this is truly an elite, and they feel particularly separated, as they already are, from the rest of society. Now, the central piece, and we will make here, according to the video genre, some sort of stereotypical ideation of this type of equipment. There would be many different types of armor, of shields, of lances, of swords, of secondary weapons of sort. Naturally, the Carolingian heavy cavalryman would be the guy that was proficiently trained with every single weapon existing at the time. Never think that, the sense, like, I don't know, a peasant used a certain type of weapons that the Carolingian heavy cavalryman in this case was not able to use much better than him. It's not just that this is a true panzer that is starting to get functionalized increasingly towards a heavily an increasingly more, as we said before, heavily collectively trained, battle tactics with shock charges, as we'll see now, with very heavy equipment, right, that require an incredible level of psychophysical quality, right? And don't think in this sense that also the genetic selection of these individuals was sort of random. It wasn't much sort of embedded in the social code as such. It just emerged from the literal blood of the battlefields and those who had been able to survive. And the Saint Charlemagne elevated, in order to counter the weight of nobility, some warriors from very humble, positions in society, as they were sort of deserving, and in this sense elevating themselves to the level of proper of liberty that is connected with nobility of blood. In fact, in imperial Catholic tradition, it's very important to stress also in the mentality of this, especially of the guy would be a Carolingian heavy cavalryman, the fact that the Franks had a very fluid sense of in a fluid and incredibly harsh and serious and committed sense of the value of individual liberty, right? This was true, obviously, at this point, largely for the establishment, because they were the people who actually controlled and commanded other people. But in this sense, even at the higher echelons of society, the idea is that the same king, the same emperor, had to command just out of his Holy Ghost, and so his charisma, his imperium, his virtue. And if he could deliver victory, and so he was not, he would not, right, tread on the sort of the autonomy of single individuals. It's a bit like the concept of the knight errant. There are sort of personal bonds across the social ladder. These people owed much to one another. The entire system was held together through this military clienteles and the capacity of sort of serving in exchange for retribution. As we well know from the many videos we made on the vassalatic beneficiary system. And in this sense, the way you would seek as a Frankish aristocrat, like the way of arms in the many also feuds that kept existing within the system, etc., and traveling across this wide world that you had properly seen growing under the leadership of this sacred ruler, the new Roman emperor, was unchallenged, and it was properly the leader's duty to be able to gather so many men for battle, for campaign every year in the field of May, on the basis of the procedure, how you could reward them through great conquests that obviously permanently ignited the fantasies of these men. That, as you know, also from the Carolingian epos in this sense, truly believe in not just in being and becoming the doctrine of two natures, but as you have the beautiful scene of Roland dying at Roncesvalles and he crying for the Durandal, right? Not for his woman that is actually in tears at home because she knows he's dying, but for his alter ego, like the sword itself that contained the soul, the virility, the double, right, the transcendental double of the warrior, as we've seen also in many videos about Christian holy war, right, and the deep metaphysical transcendental meaning of the same. Anyhow, as we were saying, the central piece for protecting his torso was a corselet called a brunia or boigne. Images from that time often show it made of scales attached to a leather backing. So it's a studded armor, fundamentally. It could be very varying also in the degree, in the sense of heaviness. There wasn't some sort of simple standardization, but it's also worth pointing out that the Franks had the best arms and armor available in the West. They widely exported it. Think about all Viking blades being in great part proper imports. The Franks had in the upper Rhine, upper middle Rhine, the greatest arms and armor production. In the West, as you know, metallurgy was replete with deep metaphysical meanings and mythological sort of metaphors and sort of deep awareness. The same. This was mostly exemplified in the sword, but the defensive gear has also a deep level. It's as if this armor had become the same skin of the warrior. There are all kind of influences in Frankish equestrian culture, as you know, from quite a long time. Roman, so obviously what the Germans had by themselves. Admittedly, especially peoples like the Franks, especially the West Germans, did not really have much of that. Just the North Germans had less, but they all shared, obviously, the Indo-European ideal of the hero as the mounted warrior, right? The errant knight. This is evident if you look at in the Vandal era, finds, etc. Like this is never over. Like the entirety of Europe has this. There had been Hunnic influence, had been Avar influence. There had been lots of different enemies that had contributed to this. There seemingly was an important, also Gallic tradition historically, a Breton one, also Gothic Lombard one that at some point the same Franks had praised as being originally superior than the same Frankish one. At this point, they were, however, at the top, right? And what I was saying is that to a degree, of course, this type of armor could be standardized, like could be at least uniformed by the standards of the era in lots, in sort of broader capacity of purchasing this through, again, aristocrats and nobility. This is not immense, again, uniformity does not exist in a modern sense, and even today everything is alike in terms of equipment. Telling you the truth, there is always a degree of customization and personalization, and consider that at this time in general, every piece is considered unique, not just due to the way it was crafted, but probably because it was normally tailored to the same warrior. This is especially true for weapons, but obviously armor as well, that had to be fully ergonomic. And we have examples of the Brunia appearing in the Stuttgart Psalter. It's very famous. It has arguably the best representations of in illuminated manuscripts of Carolingian heavy troops like this one. It dates to 820, 830, kind of. In the fresco from the early 9th century at St. Benedict in Maldes, although lorica is occasionally used as a synonym, because, of course, in Praetorian language, there wasn't even much of a difference. Specifically, the Brunia came here, the Bearn. There are all kind of different etymologies, but let's say the standard Middle Latin for armor was the same ancient one, lorica. We're not going to make much philology here because it practically does not matter. Like, there is this idea that the Brunia is, again, this essentially studded armor, whereas the lorica is would be the chainmail, but it's a false categorization because at least these terms could overlap, right? And in fact, there is also this stereotype about the Brunia. If you talk about Carolingian cavalry, the first thing that comes into your mind is the Brunia, right? Because this is to be found, obviously, in many documents, and there is a representation of this, as we were saying, also from an iconographic point of view. But at the same time, we know very well that chainmail armor was still there, so that wasn't like a categorical reason why any people would prefer this or that. There is, the more you move towards the steppe for sort of different technical and social reasons, the specific tactics of the steppes and their political organization. But if you look at the Frankish era, of course, again, not just the chainmail would have been there as a major armor in all across the Frankish world, but the Brunia would have been used by other peoples as well. It was used by the Anglo-Saxons, it was used by the Lombards, it was used by sort of many different peoples that fought with the Franks and at some point were defeated, and also, in fact, properly started fighting for the Franks and became, quote-unquote, the Carolingians in that regard, a looser definition. You have also a certain notion here, that is to say, regions in the south of the empire would have fundamentally possessed greater abundance of, if not of weapons proper, but of greater proper material availability, and therefore also protective gear compared to the north. But this seems also nonsensical, really, because the finest elite, properly in a social military sense, came exactly from the north. The center of the Carolingian Empire will remain later, is fundamentally the core of what will stay the Western Frankish kingdom, right? Northeastern France, parts of Belgium, And so they had the best military organization. They had the greater access also to the aforementioned Rhine land production. So to claim that the Mediterranean regions fundamentally were richer, it is technically true, right? By a degree. This is also debatable because, frankly, so we're talking in terms of per capita wealth. This is absolutely true for example, for Italy. But in terms of raw material availability through the estate system, like, again, Gaul has the best army for a reason, right? Because this elite is functionalized in ways that, so to claim that sort of richer areas simply equating to better armor, especially for a specific type of trooper, that does not make much sense, right? It is true that, of course, these other countries had some important arms and armor tradition that was quite advanced. Like if you look at former Visigothic Septimania, the Spanish March, the former Lombardic Italy, being especially well supplied, there's absolutely no doubt they had sort of formidable urban economies. They had really a very advanced level of sort of arms and armor development. We've seen this also in sort of, especially the series about 11th to 14th century horses, slightly later in time. But overall, we know that, I don't know, think about the later Toledo blades that Zaragoza wants, just to make an example. We know that in the Iberian Peninsula, there was a great deal of experimentalism, all right? So, again, this is really an irrelevant talk, right? Who went to war just for the fact that he did arm, like as a heavy cavalryman, had all what was needed. Because this is the passage I was also hinting at before. You have society at large being partly exhausted and partly reliant on this elite, at some point working fundamentally for it, right? When you arrive at the Crusade era, but what start calling as feudalism in a more stereotypically acceptable way, you realize that for a single night, right, you had all the priests that had to specifically indoctrinate him in perfecting their faiths. You had the peasants that have to work for buying the equivalent of arms and armor, producing it. Obviously, you have a net system that revolves around the elite here. And this mentality is brutally pronounced in Carolingian culture already. Right, so even when we look, remember what I said before about other cultures that had actually a scarce amount of cavalry overall, but that still were fixated since ever with the hero / cavalryman. Well, you can imagine in a place like Gaul, like France, that had fundamentally the annex areas. Here I'm approximating, obviously, but say Francia, it's better. That had all the means available and all the level of ideological projection that we discussed before, if they weren't hyper sort of qualified at every single level. And this was probably, again, the army that conquered half of Europe, something utterly insane for the day and age. The Carolingian era is an explosion of moral superiority. That there is no other way of describing this. I don't know if we're talking about that later, but we'll see perhaps some provincial variations at the end of the video. And of course, there was a lot of lamellar armor, still from the migration era, from different influences. We find this particularly actually in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, in Italy, in other places that the Franks came to conquer far east. Think about the frontier that temporarily existed before the arrival of the Magyars between the Franks and the Bulgars. As a matter of fact, needless to say, there is a vast level of Frankish impact, right? Especially from this broader Central European military hub, especially towards the Slavic world. Right, the Frankish influence on Slavic arms and armor is sort of striking. This was already true before the Carolingian era. Most of this is always true if you look at, at Slovakia, right? This was at some point under the Avars, etc. But if you look at the archaeology of it, they don't look much sort of step influenced their arms and armor for how poor they were. They followed a Frankish mold. This is true, as we were saying before, for the Scandinavians. They also start fighting against the Carolingians more intensely at this point. Charlemagne enters, as you know, the Jutland itself. Like, there is the Anglo-Saxons that sort of we conceive mostly as islanders. As a matter of fact, they were heavily influenced by Frankish material culture as well, and it would be interesting to make a bit more of a military history of the Anglo-Saxons in service of the Carolingians, which is an interesting, and vice versa, by the way, that I've never quite sort of focused much on, but it's really important. So here we still proceed by stereotype. Like, if you think at greaves, you can imagine here a splint armor type, right? This is not following literally the model that I'm using here, the poster guy in the thumbnail. So this is sort of something you can't gather from all the rest of the evidence. And this greaves of splint armor type were referred to as bagnberge or bauga, and they were made of iron or sometimes leather as well, because for how economy has sort of been kicking back in, especially in certain parts of the empire, namely northern Gaul, northern Italy, the fringes in particular were fairly poor, and they used this natural, that was leather, bone, historical. Like, you have all these very interesting materials, and interestingly enough, very much following the pattern of the structure of armor, if possible, material allowing itself, right? So this is a bit like in antiquity. The greaves obviously would shield the lower legs, starting in particular no later than the late 8th century, which suggests, like in other times in history, probably an important infantry capacity as well, because of course, like, if you're on a horseback, you have to be well protected no matter what. But usually, this happens also in other periods. Like, the idea that infantry here is relevant, right, and dangerous, and that as if you are charging to them as a knight, you must have your legs well protected, actually tells us something about it. Naturally, the fact that sort of conventionally that this armor becomes more apparent towards this part is because, again, we have a better equipped and ever more elite force. For that matter, this kind of armor is sort of universal, and it just changes in degree, in sort of in size and material over the centuries, but it's fundamentally always of the same kind. You can imagine one vambrace or manica protecting the right arm alone. We're talking here the heaviest type of cavalryman, right? And this would be naturally of sort of some sort of lamellar construction, similar to the ones in fact used in antiquity. The left arm depended rather on the shield for defense, right? So this is something you find also in the East. Importantly enough, there was still, again, lots of contact with the steppes, enough for the Carolingians themselves to be aware in any case of different designs out there. But we would probably be surprised by how frequent the presence for the elite of this kind of arms and armor really was. Like, unfortunately, we don't have so much material evidence for this, but it's kind of obvious that could be there. Like, later we'll talk about the helmet, for example, and the classicizing type that I also used here. Many people said it never existed. But, I mean, what the hell do you know about that? It could easily exist. Like, I'm pretty sure that somewhere it actually existed, even if it was a classical motive. It's just like, it's not like if the Spangenhelm was the most common type of helm, like, there was no other type fundamentally of sort of variation or adaptation, experimentation. Was it even just for ceremonial purposes? It could well be something inspired to an older era, and we've seen in our Arms and Armor series in general how actually varied iconographic archaeological evidence really is. So it's again, all very far from standardization in the way we modernly think of it. According to Notker, gauntlets reinforced with mail were also indicated, even if these features remained quite uncommon as well, right? So you did have some specific sort of hands armor at point. You understand how heavy this cavalryman really is. And so we're talking that this could be easily a paladin of Charlemagne in himself, and they wouldn't even always fight with the same degree of armor, right? They could be quite flexible depending on tactics of the type of action and in operational context. But there were all kinds, also interchangeable arms and armor, and this is especially the case for this this high noblemen with their very rich possessions and sort of robust military clienteles, attendants, etc. Distinct protections for limbs show up in Carolingian texts but are missing from both artwork and excavated remains, which is actually normal. I would like to stress this. The fact that there is no archaeological evidence of certain types of arms armor at this point in history in particular does not really mean too much. Right, it's easier to ask yourself whether that would have been functional if other peoples were using it. For example, the Khazars in southeastern Europe at the time were familiar with such armor, and the Byzantines likely were too, meaning that an Eastern-style vambrace and greaves in Khazar Byzantine fashion may have appeared on the most elite Carolingian mounted warriors, or they may simply have had one type of their own. Right, probably were. Also arms and armor are much more universal than we tend to think. If you look at the spread, for example, of the kite-shaped shield down the line, it starts appearing sort of in the Byzantine Empire at the same time it's happening in Ottonian Germany, right? So we shouldn't be too fussy or presuming that there is one guy that at some point creates this type of shield. How many types of shields can you make, really? It's a completely modernistic and technologistic misconception. It has nothing to do with the art of war. Under the corselet, tunics of leather or padding similar to the bambakion, that is the Byzantine version of the Greek name of it, serve to absorb blows that might break bones or produce bruises, even if they did not pierce the exterior shell. This is naturally a very important element, because there is all a debate regarding how frequently used padded armor was in antiquity, probably more than we think. As you know, the problem is that fundamentally it does not survive as organic material in archaeology, even though sometimes it does. And it gradually increased in medieval times. Surely, if these are the guys that are literally charging at 45 kilometers per hour against other people who were charging at 45 kilometers per hour, so there are people that are literally smashing into each other at 90 kilometers per hour, sort of wanting to have something that absorbs impact, even though at that point, if you sort of smash into an equivalent, you will not pass through one another with this weird theory of subatomic particles. You will literally be physically destroyed. Padded armor cannot do really much for you, but in general, right, padded armor can do miracles even against for those who use it without the metal one. And if especially against projectiles, if there's or just melee sort of hits if it comes at a wrong angle, spent or whatever, right? And as we've seen also in the videos about the Nicephorian cataphract that will appear in the Byzantine Empire in the following century, there were actual cases of multiple layers of armor interspersed also on top of padded armor that could be worn also on top of everything else, with 5 distinct layers of armor, like 3 metal and 2 padded, which was literally the heaviest thing ever. We can't think that Charlemagne had something relatively similar to this, but in the 10th, the 11th century, eventually the Byzantines were the only people that were kind of aware of having created at scale in a functionally sustainable fashion that also did not seem to help them very much overall. And so there would be much debate about that, right? But the idea that there is at least some guy that is ultra and traumatically heavily armored with all this stuff, like it looks very different from what you can even see on otherwise fairly good documented Osprey booklet, is actually reality, right? Even if we don't have the direct proof of this, we can be certain they existed. But naturally, you have to bear in mind that this diversity still was modulated on the basis of a pretty ergonomically functional panoply. And so that, of course, more or less, these knights did look similar with one another, which is confirmed, again, by the available evidence. And so padded armor, as you know, has all these various important roles, like it also isolates better from temperature, whichever extreme, to keep more or less the same body temperature, to preserve better body temperature. Underneath, you have the capacity of keeping the armor from digging into the skin as well, much like the padded defenses in al-Andalus at this point that the Carolingians themselves would have been acquainted with by beating the hell out of Muslims down under the Pyrenees, and that were crafted from felt or quilted fabric, the tijfaf in Arabic. And naturally, the Emirate of Cordoba had, together with the Byzantine and Carolingian armies, the strongest armies in Europe, right? Even though, again, different peoples look frankly similar on that ground. Again, there is not much of a scholar difference. If this is intensely debated, there is, especially on YouTube, this incredibly heavy bias that, as you know, I've always battled against regarding the notion that medieval armies were small, which already is a statement. The way it's presented doesn't depose very much in favor, probably of the framework and the context, and therefore the knowledge who states that. But any regional cradle can field multiple tens of thousands of men, right? We're normally stopping to few tens of thousands. The utmost largest would be 30,000, and that would have been crushing for economies of this era, but still it was possible to field it, and we'll see this better in sort of other army organizations video. Now, another variant of armor involved a reinforced leather plate worn over the corselet, extending scale coverage down to the thighs. Yet the Franks avoided this, in part, it seems, asserting that it impeded their ability to ride in particular. But again, there were surely ways to fundamentally open this to cut in ways that would be functional for that and offer more thigh protection. There's absolutely nothing strange about that. Lamellar armor shows up now and then, as we were saying before, as numerous illustrated manuscripts appear to show it. Though archaeologists have uncovered known here, and this is also, again, completely normal. We know that, again, scale, lamellar, etc. was out. There are two different things, by the way, as you know. But they were there. They would remain there for centuries. While the elite Scola Palatina unit, this were the imperial bodyguards, wore the obviously most advanced armor available. Their outfits could very well have drawn inspiration as well from Byzantine and Islamic Arab hauberks using scales from that era, but also this notion that everything was essentially quote-unquote copied from the East. Actually, the more I studied this stuff, apologically in particular, but also iconographic and archaeology, seems to be sort of yet another categorization. I don't understand how people still propose this stuff. It sounds like wargameism more than actual reality. There would have been really nothing strange to see. Of course, like there were specific ways of making armor that in particular in some places were well done, etc. But aside from, they would have been adopted, but let's say it's not like they lacked the capacity to do an equivalent locally. Also, they had always been in contact with one another. Also, very sophisticated armor had always been used in these lands all across the board. So, again, seeing a Carolingian heavy cavalry, I should have actually used here the model with AI with scales. I may be still in time for change. Okay, but it's not that important. But just for provoking a little bit, of course, they would have worn scales. But why not? Right? And by the way, again, scales remained around, like especially in places like Germany and Italy up to the 14th century. Like it's not really so strange as it seems at all. Right, and at that point, hardly you could say that Europe was backward, whatever. And this is not even, again, the case, especially from apologically speaking. We're talking about the Franks at this point in the 9th century. Now, legal documents and capitularies, as you know, provide specific values for this full set of equipment that speak of costs. A helmet equaling 6 cows or 6 solidi. Very often this was just sort of issued for some standards, including legal ones regarding costs and how sort of certain equipment had to be produced, provided, and be found, especially available along all the various stations next to great estates, monasteries, and so on. There was, again, an incredibly thickly organized net of logistical support. And so, more or less, they tell you the scale, and it is kind of fine and well plausible. And even if, I don't know, this or that capitulary given us these figures is dated to a date or another here in the 9th century, doesn't really matter. It would have not changed that much, not even for the previous century, as a matter of fact. But things become more structured, more serious, and that's also why we have this kind of information more later than before. A helmet equaling 6 cows or 6 solidi. A helmet, right? A brunia equaling 12 cows or 12 solidi. As you understand, cows and solidi here going parallel. That's exactly what I was saying before. That there is still a very naturally based economy, especially north of the Alps. But also monetization was actually increasing at this point. That's why you find the solidi as well, obviously. A sword including its scabbard equaled 7 cows or 7 solidi. The sword by itself at 3 solidi, implying the scabbard was highly ornate for some reason. And this, again, can be profitably debated. It depends also on the quality of the sword, like compared to the helmet. Was the sword actually more... Well, yeah, helmets were actually, and armor in general, were pretty sort of difficult pieces to produce in many ways, but in general, right? Greaves equal 6 cows or 6 solidi, a lance together with a shield equaling 2 cows or 2 solidi, and a horse equaling 12 cows or 12 solidi. And this is interesting because, as you know, here we're not looking at the value of the animal just for, plowshare. Like this happened. Some war horses, when they were old, they ended up, carrying out labor because they were very costly, very precious resources. But here we're looking at a war horse, so a very specific type of breed or in particular of animal in and of itself. Like these horses were selected a bit like men. There are just some elements within the population are more aggressive. They're sort of sturdier. They smash into things. Those are the best ones. They're difficult to tame to a degree, but if you train them adequately, and as you know, the horse is an incredibly intelligent animal, and he absolutely has to earn the trust of the horseman and vice versa. And without the tandem, you can't have good cavalry at all. And so these are exactly the type of animals that tend probably to smash more head-on into enemy formations and won't shy away from it for that matter. And yes, so cavalry charged and smashed like hell, like it had always done, and at this point was sort of increasing in punching capacity, right? Here we will talk also about things like stirrup and whatever, but consider that, as you know, the stirrup is more a consequence of the increasingly smashing capacity through collective training and greater amount of mounts of availability than any cause of that. Like, in other words, it has nothing to do with it, as always. Like in many other things, like the English victories of the 100 Years' War actually owe literally nothing to the longbow, right? It could at least been substituted by a crossbow. It would have been the same. Like, so never be distracted by objects per se, of materialistic mentality. It's the gateway to hell. The horse equaling 12 cows or 12 solidi, adding up in total, when you look at the panoply, and this is just one panoply, so this stuff would regularly, the parish get broken, the same horse would die, would be crippled beyond repair, so to say. This adds up to 45 cows or 45 solidi, which that's actually a pretty big amount of wealth for the time. This was potentially lowered during Charlemagne's reign, because this is more or less where when this even its days to. Although the figure decreased apparently from 45 to 40 solidi under the same reign at some point. So this could float, but it's again, remember, like mostly a legal issue here. It does not directly reflect what these cavalrymen went at war with. This was the top tier, obviously, of heavy cavalry. This type of segmentation, sort of the heavy cavalry, some sort of lighter, medium cavalry at least, then infantry, and then at the bottom. So there were different levels at some point, but at the bottom, like some guys just with bow and quiver, existed all across the Romano-Germanic world, also across most other peoples, telling the truth. And so, again, these forces were relatively similar also to the ones of the Carolingian neighbors, right? Estates belonging to the crown seldom surpassed 50 cows when excluding oxen, heifers, and bullocks, highlighting how rare fully outfitted fighters were, right? So there is always a difference between the issue and reality. Mostly, when you look at these laws, you have to think about standards that have to be hopefully met. And also, if you can't meet that, you're going to be cut off properly from that level of promotion, participation, etc. This is very interesting from a social point of view, because part of that aristocratization did stem from the necessity of these standards to be able to make war. And society, in a sense, was organizing to provide, again, these fewer but better equipped troops, so that warfare would become, in many ways, more functional. Of course, there was all a plethora of troops following. Normally, the local level militia would actually go at war in certain circumstances, even though much more limited and shorter range, limited in time and shorter range geographically than the elite. Through a rota system that had, again, always been the case, nobody could be and would ever be literally drafted, so to say. This did not happen in the Middle Ages. There was no way to do it, as a matter of fact. But the elite was to be, in this sense, very proficient, and the entire empire was organized in itself, in this sense, to sustain not much, just a local lord that eventually, as you know, in the post-Carolingian era would emerge as the local protector, and there already was in many ways, but that could in fact cross these thousands of kilometers across Europe, served by all the various logistical stations, prepared by, in fact, the rest of society all across, and would allow, in fact, some more efficient troops to be the crack, the spearhead, to be there, and complemented by, at that point, local militias, auxiliaries, etc., that lived along the frontier, right? Sometimes some elite forces were sent to fight far away, in fact, from those countries that they originated from, because they had been conquered by the Carolingians, right? You have a lot of also lower tier type of mercenary troops. Like, we know that there were, again, elite forces from different nations that the Carolingians had subdued, as always, due to cooptation and having those princes with them in the army for political reasons. You would have other bands of mercenaries. You would have the same Vikings. You would have sort of different groups that had historically served as mercenaries. The Saxons, for example, kept sort of serving large numbers in the Carolingian army, and so there is a divide also between the local lord that is subjected sort of now to Carolingian rule and does not want to go fight on a distant frontier. Normally, for example, the Saxons were brought, also because of scarcity of wealth for that matter, just to fight against the Slavs in the eastern frontier. But some lord would have said also, I don't want to pay too much for this expedition, whereas maybe a guy that had originated exactly from his place, but was in the Carolingian army for a lifetime because he was a humble person that decided to go make a living as a mercenary, right? And this included mercenaries, and in fact, as we were saying, heavy cavalry as well, sort of to some degree. That was never like sort of the best elite that the Carolingians had, but could be raised to that through social and political promotion. Laws from the mid-8th century among the Ripuarian Franks specify helmet at 6 solidi, brunia at 12 solidi, a sword and scabbard at 7 solidi, a sword alone at 3 solidi, legs at 6 solidi, a lance and shield at 2 solidi, and a horse at 12 solidi. So you understand that this didn't really change at all. From Charlemagne's times, this source obviously is useful. It provides comparison to common goods, being allowed with an ox worth 3 solidi and a cow ranging from 1 to 3 solidi. So you understand here, it's difficult to simply say to make an equivalence across different documents. It can mean different things, different regions, different political situation. Definitely a lot changes through this era, and they're just laws, right? These are dispositive sources. They do not tell you what an army looked like. They're not supposed to, all right? Now, laws issued by the mid-8th century Longobarд king Aistulf, just prior to Charlemagne's takeover in northern Italy, and actually because of the repeated Frankish invasions of the Italian kingdom at that point, Aistulf was quite a commander. He fought head-on the Carolingians themselves and lost, by the way, expressed the desire that merchants too would assemble equipped as follows: the wealthiest possessing armor, shield, spear, and horses, those of moderate means bringing a shield, a spear, and a horse, and the least affluent arriving on foot carrying a bow, quiver, and arrows. All right. This is very interesting because Aistulf had just subsumed parts of the formerly Byzantine territories in Italy, and there apparently these Romans were involved in mercantile activities. The same Longobarд kingdom was actually sort of ramping up, like in driving those commercial transactions. So the idea that there were lots of wealthy people that were not noblemen by birth, but that could sustain like a military equipment is there. It is something that actually continues in Italy with its wealth. We've seen it in the communal army later on, where during the communes there is a proper nobility, also feudal or even of Carolingian origin, but the majority of the milites will eventually be those recruited because they were wealthy enough in pursuing this sense of military lifestyle like the others. And just because, of course, by public law, you had at some point to serve in the army, which was a privilege as much as a duty, as a matter of fact, but first and foremost, a privilege. And as we were saying before, if you look at these laws of recruitment across the various peoples, they look pretty much the same. If you look at the Carolingian capitularies, you look at Aistulf's law, they're the same segmentation, essentially. They're the same idea of social stratification and military equipment ad personam. Various Carolingian capitularies built on these requirements. The one from Herstal in 779 mandated Brogne, that is the male hauberks, Brogne and Jambières, to stick to some French, and this would be armed defenses, were ordered in 803. We know this again from different documents. The Salz capitulary, the same 803, mentioned Brogne and weapons. The Thionville one in 805 repeated this. The Boulogne capitulary in 811 specified Brogne and swords. And as early as 802, counts kept stockpiles of brunier and helmets for their followers as well. Never underestimate the redistribution aspect of this, that the military clienteles we're looking at now with the seniores and the bassi are basically like the same war bands mechanism that has just stepped up in a more organized and structured fashion. And their ethos, their beliefs, their practice were pretty similar to all peoples around, right? You have at a minimum also the requirement to maintain such items for personal use, whereas a capitulary around 802 compelled counts to possess extra brunier and helmets for outfitting retainers. The Franks obviously had an old history of this more aristocratically separated military retinues. Think about the Antrustiones. We've checked my videos about migration era warfare. You'll find information about this, and you have again the distinct impression these are not some levies. These are basically the bodyguards of the lords of the various counts that ruled the empire. They were few but well armored and especially experienced men that their lords were able to keep in this way at their own expenses. And so there you have, again, the lack of a quote-unquote state as we understand in a modern sense, and rather the military clientele that makes society itself. And then there would be, again, lots of other troops, including levy militias, auxiliaries, all kind of forces that would follow, but this was the peak elite, right, of the hierarchy of the ranks. The Capitularia Missorum, dated 792-93, required from holders of benefices and offices wealthy enough to afford them horses, armor, shield, spear, spada, this would be the longsword. The semispatum, this was a long dagger sax, secondary weapon, whereas in 792-93, every cavalryman needed a shield, lance, longsword, and short sword, but not armor, which may well mean that they actually did, but it was not specifically explicitated, because in general, people of that echelon of society just for having a cavalry equipment and the warhorse, etc., would, for their safety, go to war with armor. Right, so this is, again, incredibly important. Again, there were also lighter type of cavalry, and of course armor was not sort of everywhere at all. There were much more lightly armored horsemen as well, and we will make videos about that too. But in this sense, depending on what you talk about, you can more or less know what kind of gear would have been likely. Even when you see, this happens also in other contexts. This is interesting also in terms of organizational logistical standpoint, where in the laws of recruitment, you're told you just have to go to war with with bow and quiver, or just with a quiver. But what does that mean? Like, who does provide the bow? Your own lord at that point. So there are stores of this. What about the arrows? The cost, actually, right? So next to the societal group, there is a level of power concentration that is always private in the hands of the Franks, that have literally a private nature of, speaking of public culture in many ways. But in this sense, does not mean they were poorly organized. On the contrary, they were incredibly efficient and functional in this way. And so there would be a level of redistribution of arms and armor, because if you really want to make tens of thousands of men work, you logistically, you can't rely on scattered in that sense, organization. This is not a migration era where there are peoples who move for hundreds of kilometers across centuries, all with their own Fahrgemeinschaft and to think about their own supply. This is something else, right? Here there is a staggeringly hierarchical level of power and a much more functionalized and unitary and compact force that is able to wield an incredible thunder, so to say, on the continent. By 805, the rules had apparently shifted so that failing to don brunia, body armor, could result in forfeiture of both rank and accompanying lands. Again, we grab this information from scattered sources that are not necessarily coherent with one another, because they would have come from different contexts and responding to very ad hoc situations among different groups. In 806, Charlemagne's letter to Abbot Fulrad directed that every mounted man carry a bow plus multiple quivers of arrows alongside a shield, spear, sword, and axe, resembling gear more suited to mounted foot soldiers and creating a challenge because it required each rider to have a bow and several quivers of arrows in addition to a shield, spear, sword, and axe. But don't think in this sense that the Carolingians did not have horse archery on their own. Actually, the Stuttgart Psalter provides this. I also inserted here with a beautiful image of that. And people say, well, but this is maybe showing the Avars. It doesn't mean anything, all right? The Franks had it on their own. And then, of course, they had it Also because, again, their world ended in the east at the steppes, and there was an influence of those peoples, no doubt. But you can't say, okay, that thing is just that people, because stereotypically you think they didn't have to fight with bow from horseback. On the contrary, again, if anything, if you were a Carolingian nobleman, you knew how to use a bow on horseback, like all medieval aristocracy, because you spent the time you didn't spend fighting by hunting, right? And they're not even particularly different enterprises from a technical standpoint. So, of course, every Carolingian heavy cavalryman was skilled in horse archery. It's just that they didn't principally need that, right? But it would frequently happen that they had to use it. And also as dismounted warriors, but not only. Another capitulary lists among weapons a bow, 2 bowstrings, and 12 arrows, and yet another insists on more than a single quiver of arrows. Gifts help maintain troops on the borders. For instance, when Prince Siconolf of Salerno, this was a Lombard in the mid-9th century, presented Rothrid, one of his fideles, with lorica, spada, calea, lancea, et clippeum, literally the sorts of hauberk, sword, helmet, spear, and shield. Or when the domesticus Dodo, a backer of Mayor Pepin, had sufficient wealth to supply his men with male hauberks, helmets, shields, lances, swords, bows, and arrows, in the source Lurices et Cassidis, Clipes et Lances, Gladis, que precinti et sagittis cum faretris, you definitely know that this was not merely a donative, but already in and of itself a systematically functional mechanism through which soldiers were sort of promoted. We say soldiers because in this sense they were factually maintained. This was the familia, the masnata, what will remain at the core, in fact, of high medieval European lordly retinues as heavy cavalry, right? And with part of some of these retinues were also lighter, weren't just heavy cavalrymen, right? And or they could fight in different roles as well, because they had to be tactically complete, and that's why also all this range of weapons, right? But the other point is that there wasn't a proper salary, right? And this is how what we call the feudal system was, quote unquote, born. Like the commendatio existed since Roman Gaul, but and before, for that matter, the Celts surely had something similar, even in their sort of more primitive society that with scarcer surplus. We know they were heading towards sort of more professional retinues, mercenaries, towards the later Latin period. Think about the solduroi of Caesar's times. That literally means like just the same etymology of in Latin of solidus. It's properly for the pay, right? So there was a minimal pay, but through the support that the Lord provided to this man with his own personal property, right? With his surplus, etc. These were obviously societies in pre-industrial times that constantly reinvested wealth, because if you didn't properly equip your men, you would have likely underperformed, let's put it this way. And it's not much that you could have been killed, obviously enough, but you could have not also promoted yourself politically. And so nobody even posed themselves the question that this was the privilege as well of being. And so whoever had that wealth at the time was into this kind of lifestyle, right? And today we don't talk much about the difference between aristocracy, this enriched merchants, etc., because to them, after all, it wasn't just much about a class of recruitment. It was just about those who could actually go and due to their wealth to begin with, or whichever other means if they had. So there were all ways also to enter the Carolingian army, so to say. And they were surely, like, these retinue men were lifetime soldiers. That's what makes them so interesting. And we're talking about retinues of abbots, for example. Think about Nithard. Think about it's plenty of instances where the same bishops were obliged actually to bring their military contingents up to the front, and then if they wanted they could come back, but they had at least to come in person because they had to be responsible as well for the secular force, aside from what they normally, in fact, controlled as the city garrisons, and would become very effective, as we've seen in some videos of Carolingian Ottonian warfare as well, in the clashes between East and West Francia. But they would also often fight themselves, which is a tradition that, as you know, in Europe continued for centuries. In all these countries, telling the truth. Now, throughout the Carolingian period, the body armor that we described continued to be the single priciest piece of military gear by a wide margin. Helmets consisted mainly of iron, frequently forged in one piece, featuring prolonged guards at the back of the neck, as depicted in works such as the Stuttgart Psalter, a design that lacks full explanation. No examples exist in digs, yet comparable helmets appear rendered more precisely in Italian artwork, both preceding and following the Carolingian age. And Italy's where the akin sallet helmet emerged in the 14th century, suggesting the enigmatic Carolingian version may trace back to a late Roman style that persisted in Italy and within the Byzantine Empire before diffusing broadly across Europe in the form of the 14th century sallet, possibly representing either a stylistic trope in art or an intermediate stage between the late Roman cassis and two-piece helmets from 11th century southern France, although rich versions in miniatures predate the era when Western European smiths are thought to have mastered such craftsmanship, and these rich helmets nearly always adorn evil figures like Goliath in illustrations by monks, leading to the possibility that monastic artists linked such unusual headgear to adversary societies like the Islamic realm, where rich helmets undeniably existed by the 11th century, if not before, alongside another helmet type visible in both imagery and artifacts, including 4th to 5th century Romano-Byzantine examples, as you can find, for example, at the Vojvodiansk Museum of Novi Sad and the Castle Museum of Kerak as well. So this is interesting because, as we've seen, in fact, in different videos, especially the Iberian Peninsula we mentioned before for advanced metallurgy and arms and armor, properly military technology, seems to have provided us things that are very similar. If anything, especially in iconography, to some designs that eventually appeared later. In some, by the way, what will become like France and Italy that had already been, but Spain in that sense was also at a point peak during the High Middle Ages, arms and armor production centers. And this is this doesn't mean again that these designs again specifically come from there just because we can document, but we see, for example, here in the Carolingian era, this type of classical helmet showed multiple times. And so whatever they had in mind, there's no doubt to think that since it's fairly similar to later models and others that may have existed before, again, what do we actually know, right? We don't have this overwhelming amount. We don't know. We don't have a photograph of a Carolingian army or a Carolingian heavy cavalryman, all right? So actually, I'm pretty open to the idea that this is surely some sort of classicistic iconography resumed for the sake of, again, the Carolingian Empire as Rome and so on. But there may easily still be some type of helmet that looked like that at the time. Let's pass to the shields now. Shields were constructed from, obviously, wood covered in leather, as sort of pretty much was the habit, not just among various peoples, but from quite a long time, with planks fastened by tiny nails on both sides, incorporating a lengthy iron handle in a strengthening bar attached to by rivets inside, featuring raised bosses extending as far as 20 centimeters in interior metal frameworks. The shield's reverse side exposing the metallic structure supporting the rounded shape. The lance stayed the chief weapon, measuring 2 to 3 meters, delivered mostly, but things could and would be done in any possible way, overarm or hurled as well. When account portrays Charlemagne routinely bearing a javelin for throwing, but midway through the 9th century occasionally appears stuck under the arm as a lance. And so in ways that were already and evidently sort of heading towards a more standardized type of crochet lance type of combat charge, in particular for the later centuries. But again, spears would have been used in all kind of ways up to the contemporary era, right? You can do whatever with these lances. But yes, there is a preferred way of eventually using it for the sake of collective training, and this is also proof that sort of weapons adapt to tactics and not the other way around. Now, a sword and dagger served as backups. The sword having a wide fuller grip of wood wrapped in leather, pommel and crossguard inlaid with gold, its scabbard suspended by 3 slim straps from belt or baldric typically at least, or alternatively a scabbard of wood clad in leather featuring a carved wooden slider, binding of birch bark and bronze end cap. This, again, tell you how elaborated, as we've seen before, these panoplies really were, and how colorful likely they also were at the point. This is yet another sort of underestimated and represented matter. The single-edged sax endured even with Byzantine assertions of its outdated status. The Byzantine Emperor Leo possibly being behind the times in stating, quote, "They are armed with shields and spears and spation contoteron," that is, short sword or sax, since additional proof of points to the single-edged sax losing popularity by then, and there exists a wide-bladed single-edged dagger with wooden handle and bronze pommel open on one side. Its leather case hung on a leather loop from the belt, reinforced with bronze bands at the mouth and an open-work bronze tip, whereas sword likely of early Islamic make, discovered close to the Poitiers battlefield site in 732. That's also interesting, because the Muslims were for a while, actually for a long time, in southern Gaul. And this sword possesses an extremely wide fuller, for example. Simple iron crossguard and pommel and grip covered in leather. As you know, the fuller is not like the blood-dripping channel. It's basically just to sort of confer the sword, first of all, a lighter weight, but also a sort of balancing properly the physics of this word is pretty complicated. At some point we'll make an entire video explaining this, but making it actually more elastic. So this was also all one with probably the type of steel and so on, and that's why it gets complicated. But you can say also different things regarding the type of combat, right? Tendentially, the idea is that especially in the Islamic world, and so therefore parts of the Mediterranean, swords are less suited for breaking armor, so they're less, like in this case, less full, because there is less armor, because there is also less of a feudal society. So at least actually it may have, this depends on, it's not like there is less armor because there is a feudal society, but in general the best armor, that it could have been true incidentally for these countries. In some cases, like North Africa wasn't richer than Spain, even under same Islamic rule. But the first of all, we get mostly throughout all eras the most elite type of weapons. For pre-industrial times, like the idea is that the elite preserves more, better, can afford even to bury these weapons at a point. And in any case, also in iconography, you represent the best kind of equipment, normal. And in this part of the Mediterranean, being there less armor, the idea is that blades had to chop more as opposed to sort of smash more, right? So this is part of the reason why this sort of Arabic-styled sword would have looked like that. But sure, there were many Aquitanians and even Franks that would have used that type of sword because, I don't know, in their own personalized panoply, they felt better with it, right? Was that maybe all what they could afford? Normally, those swords tended also to be relatively flatter. So again, this is debatable to a degree, but it does follow an actual pattern. Now, spurs took the form of bronze prick spurs, a style employed from Roman days through the 14th century, directly continuing Roman practice. Clothing worn under armor indicated social standing, right? Everyday items included linen shirts and undergarments. Imagine all the weather that these guys would have had to go through across Europe. This was mostly a Central Western European dimension, but again, winters or autumns and at the end of the season, of warfare, are not particularly gentle. In summer, if you're fighting in Denmark, you can indeed, feel a bit cold at times. Given that we're talking about elite troops here, we can imagine tunics edged with silk, for example, leg coverings, legs wrapped crosswise, footwear, and cloaks in blue, for example. According to Einhard's account of the emperor, says he wore the national, that is to say, the Frankish dress. His shirts and drawers were of linen. Then came a tunic with a silken fringe and hose. His legs cross-gartered and his feet enclosed in shoes. In winter, he defended his shoulders and chest with a jerkin made of otter and ermine skins. Interestingly enough, he was clad in a blue cloak and always wore a sword with a hilt and belt of gold or silver. Right? This is the metals of sacred rule. Occasionally, Charlemagne used, I'm continuing to read, he used a jeweled sword, but this was only on great festivals or when he received foreign ambassadors. Right? I made a video, by the way, about medieval relics, including the ones that were properly, and we don't know 100% how this worked, again, because we don't have much of the archaeological evidence, but we do know that there were hilts that contained relics, for example. It were all these kind of jewels, etc. So this is absolutely historical. So going on with Einhard, he disliked foreign garments, however beautiful, and would never consent to wear them, except once in Rome, on the request of the Pope Hadrian, and again upon the entreaty of Pope Leo, when he wore a long tunic and cloak and put on shoes made after the Roman fashion, as a truly Roman emperor in the urbs. Writing in the late 9th or early 10th century in his life of Charlemagne, the monk of St. Gall detailed Frankish Carolingian attire. Boots gilded externally and adorned with laces 3 cubits in length. Red thongs encircle the legs, beneath which they donned linen of matching color on legs and thighs, embroidered in rustic style. These laces extended over the linen pieces and over the crossed thongs, at times under them and at times over, alternately in front and behind the leg. Next followed a fine linen shirt, followed by a sword belt with buckle. The large sword was first enclosed in a sheath, then covered in leather, and finally wrapped in linen stiffened with glossy wax. The final element was doubled into a square shape, allowing it, when draped over the shoulders, to reach the feet, both front and back, while barely descending to the knee at the sides. Carried on the right was an apple wood staff with even knots, sturdy and fearsome. It had a handle of gold or silver ornamented with design attached. Habits evolve, however. I'm continuing to read from this. And during wars with the Gauls, and so here is likely referring to the Celtic Bretons, because naturally these Eastern Frankish, these Teutonic monasteries were a bit, especially at this point in history, well, especially later with the Ottonians and the Byzantine marriage, but obviously classicizing, right? They were recovering a great deal of also Roman classical ethnography and tropes and so on. The Franks observed the latter displaying small striped cloaks with pride, prompting them to abandon their traditional dress and copy the Gauls. So again, the Bretons like. Initially, the most rigid emperor permitted the change, viewing it as better for combat. The source says, yet upon discovering Frisians exploiting the allowance by vending these tiny clothes at the standard rate of the former large ones, he commanded that purchases from them be limited to the traditional cloaks, broad, wide, and long, and remarked, quote, what is the good of these little napkins? I cannot cover myself with them in bed, and when I am on horseback, I cannot shield myself with them against the wind and rain. Along with a white or blue cloak shape, so that when positioned on the shoulders, it reached the feet, front and back, but only to the knee on the sides. There's a bit of stereotyping. Naturally, this again is particularly a Alemannic perspective. So in the decades just after the dissolution of the whole Carolingian unit, but there is some, again, however they conceptualize this is quite interesting to read, and still giving us an idea of how properly they attributed importance to the style in particular, because it belonged to that people that had conquered the world. It says, for winter attire encompassed leather boots, shoes, and overshoes with wooden bottoms, sleeveless jackets of sheepskin, marten, mole, otter, or beaver pelts, although the rich could opt for costlier imported furs. As you know, it was very important for traffic all across Eurasia and the Mediterranean. Now, additional accounts illuminate the garb of the Carolingian warrior nobility as well. Hermoldus Nigellus, for example, recounted Emperor Louis the Pious bestowing on Harold the Dane a tunic with tight sleeves adorned with gems, accompanied by an elegant belt, a mantle with a slit fastened by a brooch, white gloves, and a baldric for the sword scabbard. Differences across regions signaled loyalty. In northern Germany, Saxon nobles wore gold neck rings as a mark of status among the Saxon nobility. This is something we documented as, these were the Turks, basically. It had partially survived in certain adornments, and we made videos about the Danish folklores in the Middle Ages. We saw how this was all one with the idea of the older Ulfednar, for example, and the idea that you were properly tied, you belonged to the deity at that point in the war band, and so your life was devoted to this higher purpose, where your chieftain, your lord, was a medium of divinity itself. And this was also later associated with the demonic traits associated to Woden, to the older symbolism in some etheric fashion, like saying this would eventually be not much because of the older beliefs, but the fact that sort of the werewolves were outcasts at some point. They didn't have a place in society. Already by the late Viking era, peasants were not scared. So they had to mind Ulfenars, but let's say they were not, but they had been the quite functional thing in the previous times, and they were detrimental, in fact, to local society as well. So it's mostly the reason rather than an over-demonization of whatever had happened before, right? Things simply changed. In Aquitaine, the upper estate donned tunics, loose trousers, and boots. In Italy, flowing clothes reminiscent of Roman, Byzantine, and even Islamic modes likely stem from this residual sort of Byzantine or Islamic ethics rather than weather. And in Rome, also purportedly ancient yet probably Byzantine costume style was worn for official events. All right, there was actually also in Italy that Longobardic national Langobard national character. We're talking styles. In fact, also the same Charlemagne as we've seen before, not just when he was in Rome, but in different architectural, broader cultural sense, took from the south. And so not everyone emulated also Charlemagne's preference for plain clothing, right? There was some sort of sumptuary ideal that sort of authority had to to just more evenly distribute resources, or channeling them towards, for example, the military. But there was a fierce competition between the nobility. And wealthy Carolingian lords, occasionally dressed in fabrics woven with gold threads, used gold clasps for cloaks, and wore gem-encrusted belts, a trend growing among the warrior elite starting, especially in the late 8th century when the empire was mounting, obviously enough that they were becoming richer, because they were the main beneficiaries of this expansion, or at least most of the wealth ended up, as we've seen, in their hands first. And although Charlemagne once disciplined hunting partners dressed too extravagantly by guiding them through thick brush that shredded their costly clothes, there was a general sort of an obvious display of power and wealth that truly equated to the still even partially migration era-minded Germans, because the elite was at least Germanic speaking and would remain until the mid 10th century, basically, even in the Western Frankish kingdom. Like, wealth is to be ostentated. Like, this is also partly coming from the steppes. It's something you can see among the Germans during the Völker era, so to say. In fact, it's to be seen among other peoples as well of that time. Common troops and individuals of middling status typically had basic linen or wool garments, including hooded coverings, though possibly more common for farmers. Camisia shirts, mantella or cotta capes lacking hoods, cuculla plain cloaks, kappa capes, some with hoods, pedulous hose, femoralia under drawers, a rocum belt, and mittens of sheepskin for cold weather. Yet the notion of a white tunic as uniform at, for example, this point of Andernach, where at times there were some retinues that were probably uniform, like in 876, must be erroneous if we try to extend it to broader groups as a whole. Naturally, all these colors had a meaning in general, so there were some regulations surely connected with those as well. Styles evolved slowly in this era. So when we look even here, the social segmentation just illustrated, when we think about the Carolingian heavy cavalrymen, yes, they were affluent, but it would be also different degrees of background, of probably wealth investment, etc. Now, by the late 10th century, the warrior elite still used many identical garments compared to the Carolingian era. As I said at the beginning, you don't have to think about this radical changes, right? Albeit we find them frequently now under the new French terms. This encompassed a linen shirt plus long breeches or brace reaching the ankle, secured at the waist with a cord and possibly tailored tighter below the knees. Shoes of wool or linen over the breeches gained popularity in the 11th and 12th centuries as cross-gartering declined. Over the shirt went a tunic generally to the knee. Sleeves lengthened further and were folded back to the wrists, maybe signaling affluence through excess material. The upper tier commonly incorporated embroidery or panels of alternate color on tunics with panel placement shifting over time. Such placement may indicate external Western European influences. And the opulence of attire or its maintenance also denoted rank, allowing someone to wear modest but spotless clothes and retain respect in the warrior estate. Behavior, etiquette, and postures likewise revealed social position. There was actually a deep connection with the older sort of aristocracy and its sacrality in arms. The cingulum militaris, as properly the belt carrying its sword, etc., were the proof of this. There was all a proper education, right? A proto-feudal set of training of sort of learning by heart the songs, the deeds of the heroes of the current paladins or older warriors. From the Germanic epos, you had, of course, at this point, all blended with the Bible. But I don't know, chess, there is plenty of there were some tricks. We're not talking properly about combat training, right? There were all specific skills, etc. They were all earned in battle, right, through specific experience. And we're told of this stuff. Like we were reading the account on the Battle of Strasbourg. We're talking the 4th century. Like Ammianus Marcellinus says that they were incredibly experienced Alemannic at that point. They weren't that different from the Franks. Warriors that used some sort of trick with their legs, right? That people normally interpret like they basically try to smash with their feet on the shields, but they would actually like to sort of to trick you to put you on the ground, and that's that's all something that pertained to the martial arts of the time that can be barely and attemptably only reconstructed for like reenactment HEMAs. I really don't nurture a great sort of faith towards, let's put it this way, but for the simple fact that you're not there to kill anyone, so it's that simply alone invalidates the whole thing, or at least a great part of the saying, because that's what matters. But in any case, you're not reconstructing an actual army and with its all dynamics, and so it's mostly mental, right? You will never be able to be like a Carolingian 9th century Carolingian, in this case, heavy cavalryman, right? And there was, in fact, this contrast between probably the old primitive ways of the Franks and the new influences from the Mediterranean, from Rome. The Franks, as you know, were and would remain quite stern at this top of elite. They pursued a perennial ideal. They believed probably of a heavenly dimension of sort of immobility. They had changed really a lot from the times of the forest, of the war bands, but the chiefs had always carried with them this kind of this ethos that was about the providence of the visos, of he who is able to see the future and mold it in his own image. I mean, Charlemagne does so with the world, and so it's really there, even if we tend to sort of never hear these things. That's what really mattered to them. And so overall, this ethos did not require the most powerful to always at least dress lavishly, because there had to be some show of containment, right, for the sake also of social restraint, showing again the good old more spiritual ways. And that's what all sumptuary laws across many cultures had always tried to achieve, because they understood that material wealth relaxed customs and morals and distracted from older values. Charlemagne favored uncomplicated garb, which might explain a later Italian medieval custom viewing careless attire, bad manners at table as it was said at the time, a la Carlona, and that is to say, in Charlemagne's manner. All right, but this is more like a sort of a saying. Interactions in technology influenced gear, obviously enough. As we were illustrating, for example, limb guards before, that it could be plated or splinted, recorded in documents yet missing from Carolingian archaeological sites and corresponding to those of Khazar, Byzantine, and possibly Islamic neighbors, but probably arriving through commerce or captured goods, or just being obviously manufactured locally, together with steppe elements from Avars, the later Magyars that are appearing. And so other populations living in, I don't know, in the Carpathians, in the Pontic steppe, you have the Rus that is actually forming at this point. So, and as we've seen also in different videos, we'll talk soon about probably Ruthenian cavalry, a similar video to this, albeit from a slightly later era, imported a great deal of Frankish weaponry, and they would keep doing so. Like Germany, particularly Central Europe, would sort of always expand east in that regard. And so when you look at the same fact that Charlemagne destroyed the Avar Khaganate, as a matter of fact, this matters a lot. But you can imagine context arriving from as far as China, right? And this continuing, by the way, throughout the rest of the Carolingian, Teutonian eras. And so we're not 100% sure of how certain influences could have arrived there if they were just even produced locally on a more regular basis, right? The idea of the influence, in my opinion, is kind of overrated. It existed, but it could not inform the need of having a greave, right? Certain designs, technologies, maybe, again, there's plenty, but I mean, this stuff existed also from centuries, like that they would not simply appear in Carolingian times because of the Khazars in particular. Like, it doesn't make much sense. Mail represented, as we've seen before, the predominant armor type in Carolingian and later Europe. Mail armor was not nearly as scarce as often believed. A major mistake by scholars of weapons and armor has been viewing Western Europe separately. Hence, the idea, no, they took this from the East. This is something you still see, even, the much revered Nicole, etc., saying these things about the Crusade. What if, like in the West, it was all just pretty much like everywhere else? Like, they were at the same level of development in many fields, already more advanced. You have the monk of St. Gall portraying Charlemagne at the Pavia siege, though composed, as we were saying before, a century later and requiring careful handling, wearing an iron helmet, iron sleeves on his arms. The term in the text is ferreis manicis armillatus, iron armor guarding his white chest, ferrea thorace tutatis, and an iron lance held in his left hand, right hand ready for his invincible sword as well. Naturally, it would be a lot of more than switching. Like, at some point, spears would break, and so we would pass to the swords, typically melee, but most of combat was rhythm in between charges, right? Just you would obviously find. Also, Charlemagne obviously was a warrior. These rulers risked their lives. They had to lead by example. It was still a very, at some point, champion-based individual kind of ethos. And this did revolve especially around this heavier units, right? So continuing with the aforementioned text, iron protected Charlemagne's thighs, unlike others who left them bare for quicker mounting, as did all in his army using iron greaves ochres. These iron sleeves appear distinct from mail and thigh guards, potentially incorporating stiff or splintered parts. It says, coxarum exteriora in eo ferres ambiebantur bracteolis. Right. So this is the idea that Charlemagne was hyper protected in a way or another. So this could work for a guy that was de facto a divine ruler, and so would have also extraordinary physical capacities. It was really expected, right? That there is all the proto-tournament activities that happen on a regular basis among these Carolingian horsemen, and that's where these men were expected to continuously exhibit incredible stunt capacities. This stuff was done like at the risk also of their own their own life, because you can't just imagine all the amount of crippled, paralyzed people like from all the incidents that normally occurred from this. And so it took an enormous level of training, preparation, of mental strength. This was kind of normal. It was part of the older heroic sense of warfare. This stuff existed in all European cultures at some point in time, but they weren't really normal. The astiludia, as we're called. And again, they are the same prototype of the tournament, and they fundamentally didn't even differ that much. And they actually beat the hell out of each other doing that. There were regular, sort of, again, physical damage, fractures, and also dead people, for that matter. And it was a way just to keep trained, fit. And this, as you know, continued the more seigneurial culture spread in Europe, as they had ever more the means individually to carry that out as the ultra elite. The anonymous epic Valtarius, likely from the late 10th or early 10th century, and rooted in a Visigothic Aquitanian tale, so we are in southwestern Gaul, recounting Valtarius of Aquitaine's exploit, in fact, during Attila's era. That this is along the path of the epos of the Chanson de Geste, what will become the Chanson de Geste, provides more particulars, right? This is interesting. As you know, Aquitaine had been absorbed by the Franks since the sort of the beginning, but reconquered under Charles Martel after especially the exhaustion suffered at the hands of the Muslims that were in this sense awaited destroying the Aquitainians eventually for being met at Tours, and from there taking over Aquitaine as a consequence. And so in this work, the Han ruler's armor at one juncture featured a mail hauberk of 3 layers. The text says trilicem acero loricum, so bearing the mark of the smiths as well in the text. And it's this is really interesting because this triple layer, as we were saying before, is actually what we were counting before and evidently used at this point in late Carolingian, early Ottonian period. And again, this was for the ultra elite. And we can imagine the Huns back in the day maybe having done something similar, but perhaps too excessive because they didn't have much of a feudal culture like in later times. But at the time existed also cataphracts, right, still in some form. And so you can, even for that time, just guess. It's obvious that the elite would be ultra heavily armored, but just in slightly different ways, in particular with the Huns. Here, the source is obviously sort of depicting this armor on the basis of Western models at the time. That's why it's interesting for today's video. And so a complete outfit is outlined in Baltarius' flight from the Han court as well. It says, putting on a hauberk, lorica, befitting a giant, placing a plumed helmet, casside Christus, on his head, attaching gold greaves, ochres, to his massive calves, strapping a double-edged sword to his left thigh and another to his right, as Pannonians, according to the text, customarily did, because this was meant to be Attila's place, right? The latter single-edged for one-sided wounding. Right, and remember, it's just like with Goliath that the idea is in every mythology is that the barbarian is a titan, is big and dumb, all right? But obviously enough, there's yet another argument to be made that, of course, these were also the best soldiers, and that the mythology is about sort of the sort of spiritual force that beats the barbarian. This is also what the Romans thought, for example, and others had in this sense. Internalized also since the beginning in their own. It's about the Aesir and clashing against the monsters that are definitely big and dumb in the same way. This comes from the European background. It says, he then grasps a spear, astam, in his right hand, in a shield, clipeunque, in his left. Southwestern France, the Spanish mark in Catalonia in the 10th century showed another martial impact. It originated in Islamic al-Andalus, where arms and armor of Arab Andalusian around the last decades of the 10th century included the affrangi, that is the Frankish or Western European swords, mail or sometimes lamellar. And so, as we've seen before, even a century and more later from Charlemagne, these are still relatively similar weapons in the ones that were used before. The unidentified soft armor types under mail hauberks for Carolingian and later cavalry also probably matched al-Andalus soft armors of felt or kilted stuff that remember before. On the Iberian Peninsula, felt or kilted materials served for horse armor as well, plus the tashtina derived from this is the Arabization of the Latin testinia, for head protection of horses, right? So some sort of chamfron. And this is very interesting because there is an idea that especially Central Asian influences had provided with some heavy, also Persian ones, for example, Middle Eastern one had provided the elite of this case, the al-Andalus, with this type of designs. Whereas, as you know, for horse armor in the West, we have to wait a little to be better documented. And this is also, shouldn't be strange, because we could think that collective training was actually the better armor. And as you see, as always, like the more armored element there is the horseman. Was very heavily armored, as we've seen, rather than the horse, right? But with all those projectiles around, Arab cavalrymen were definitely heavier than the Western ones, but in this sense, they needed some more widespread protection. in a non-feudal society. Also for covering, in fact, with their overall lighter and skirmish heavy kind of warfare as well. And that's an interesting aspect of it. Carolingian evidence for horse armor remains inconsistent and hard to assess. Surely there was, right? Even if iconographically and iconically in pop culture, we don't really visualize it due to the scarcity of sources. We can absolutely think on the basis of what we were methodically saying before, that if this was used somewhere in the Mediterranean, in the steppes, in the surroundings of Europe, like, why should this not be used in Europe? It doesn't make any sense, right? Silk trappings in 8th century Rome for display in processions echoed late Roman and Byzantine styles, but were apparently at least purely decorative. Silk, actually, as you know, is a pretty resistant material. We still build armor with it today, anti-projectile one. And it's not much the fact that, obviously, trappings could be, we don't know better details, but let's say the fact that it was some level, they could add some layer of protection, right? Think about the ptais rouges that also recur to a degree in the classicizing iconography of the Carolingians. There was something there. We can't properly see. Surely there were some plaques, some elements of armor. In fact, Charlemagne's forces near Pavia, the Lombard capital, in the big siege that lasted 9 months, the longest in Carolingian warfare, are once called having, quote, iron horses, meaning gray horses, the color of iron, not armored one, but somehow recalling that. Now, the most intriguing horse armor mention comes from Ermoldus Nigellus's poetry in the early 9th century, claiming javelin-wielding Celtic Bretons fielding armored riders on armored mounts. And there is a lot of, really a lot of historiography written on, say, secondary sources exploring the notion that the Bretons would have been somehow inheriting some level of cataphract culture from the Alans in the migration era. Now, there are some very specific scholars that wanted to push this narrative. I will not make any name for the sake, and I totally disagree with this. I mean, it's not like we're actually sure that this thing happened at some point, right? It's absolutely sure that the Sarmatians left some, like the Alans in particular, left some level of cataphract model or knighthood, or even just archetypal legacy in this cavalry everywhere, including the Frankish one. But the notion that the Bretons in particular would have had to have more heavily armored mounts, why? Right? They were definitely less feudal and still very more famous actually for hit and run tactics, right? So again, that this isolated province that the Carolingians also were never really fully interested in subduing formally because it was not worth of the pain, would have magically maintained some more heavily armored element, and all the rest of Europe, or at least this part of the Latin Germanic one, not. Doesn't make any sense, all right? And in fact, the source may be, there is more than this, admittedly. Again, we will probably be covering what that hypothesis was about, but we understand here that, of course, the source may be poetically licentious. At the same time, you can think it may hold some truth, meaning that if at least the Bretons used them, also the Carolingians may have used them. That's actually the most interesting datum that we can extrapolate from this. Now, the central character sports the iron helmet type common in Carolingian illustration, as you can see in the picture. He would have worn, here I used the Brunia, with short sleeves and big circular shield. You can think additional armor consisting of basic mail shows covering the front of knees and thighs. Here I didn't show, but so it's not so important to overly characterize. It's important to understand where this cavalry was coming from. Like Carolingian cavalry duties, for example, extended Merovingian practices. Basically, everything the Carolingians did, the Merovingians had already done, and the Carolingians were very good at marketing each other. And so we know that many Frankish riders at this point engaged as true cavalry, but they could obviously dismount. And there is a bit of a debate on this, because the idea, especially that cavalry, shrouded in its sort of broader meaning, would have yet to be built in a chivalric knightly sense before the full feudal age is, in my opinion, also a very misleading one, right? I've always thought that, and seen from, if you really read the sources carefully, that also during the migration era, those peoples that were in fact less properly affluent, that they could not really afford even large bodies of cavalry, were literally obsessed with knighthood. I made also some videos as far as the Anglo-Saxons are concerned, because it's normally said that they sort of normally didn't fight on horseback, of that story. And we have to learn to be a bit more fluid in this historical, a bit more plastic really, in this historical mold, right? When you look at the Strategicon, for example, it's clear at the end of the 6th century, from a Byzantine perspective, that the Germans had a lot of, if not a lot of cavalry proper, but they relied heavily on cavalry. And this was already the case, because from the mid-6th century, cavalry has surpassed infantry. Probably the world has exhausted itself with the Justinian pandemic, the aristocracy rises further, and the Byzantines don't think much of this German cavalrymen. And so there are biased accounts that show them as sort of worse horsemen. Actually, we're pretty good. You could have not really told the difference between a Lombard Arimanus and a Byzantine Cavallarius, also because they were literally the same people at some point. In the notion that at any point here, cavalry would have been fundamentally dysfunctional or not sort of impressive in the West, sort of right of the Rohirrim kind of vibe, right? It is the better answer to this. Like, that's how it could be. They could be relatively clumsy because they didn't have fully stabilized political power, whatever. But in a truly sanitary fashion, they had to properly institutionalize part of the military system. But in general, they already knew how to fight on horseback. So not just obviously individually pretty well, but they, like, as collective formations. And so the notion also, and I made multiple videos explaining how Carolingian cavalry was born, like what happened with Carolingian cavalry is that around by Charles Martel's day, but which was overall a broader dynamic, things started to be formalized properly at a political and social level in the Frankish world, bringing back together large swathes of the empire, and therefore allowing for larger amounts of cavalry to be concentrated in single operations, and therefore all the, as we've seen before, supplies, logistics that was meant to support this properly from a also social cultural background, right? Some historiography suggested there's still a minor elite fought mounting using spears, which sort of doesn't make any sense. I mean, they had always used spears. The idea that horses would stay prized spoils, it was full of horses and war horses and mounted warfare, also among very poor peoples in the East that obviously made use of lighter cavalry, but it's not like, for them, horses just cost less. So it doesn't make, again, any sense. I've always seen the Carolingian armies having a pretty robust cavalry corps, and fundamentally the whole thing revolving around that. Sure, they were more prone to dismount. If you look at the terrain they normally fought in, we're talking early high medieval Europe. I mean, in Germany, you really have to wait for the mid-12th century for having cavalry to be more conventionally just probably destined for mounted warfare, as opposed to at some point dismounting, given the marshy and forested terrains in many cases. So even there, you could always fight like that. But let's say conventional warfare, it's obvious that by the time of Charlemagne it would have been something rougher, more primitive, more tied to older mechanisms, but that sort of they had to learn how to go on horseback and to fight with weapons from it. It's sort of the dumbest idea that you can ever put forward. They already knew how to do it pretty well. Everybody did that always, right? Even the most sort of scarcely stratified Germans would have used cavalry in pretty proficient ways. I mean, even the Vikings used pretty large bodies of cavalry, up to 1/3 of their entire armies of thousands of men. So again, I don't think we need to explain anything about that. If anything, we should make more videos about that topic. It's obvious that we're also lots of lighter horsemen that we'll talk about better in another video. Riders conducting raids, ambushes, or pursuits, normally lighter. Sometimes they were the same heavies, but lightened for specific commando infiltration operations that was really needed, right? The idea that genuine shock charges likely occurred seldom, however, is wrong, right? It's that there is a very staunchly pronounced type of mounted combat championed and properly emphasized by the Franks at this point. And so late Merovingian, early Carolingian mounted forces, while definitely finding dismounted more often than in later times, were not simply sort of fighting just against lighter opponents. They clashed against, in fact, heavier ones, because also the Muslims, the Byzantines, had their own very heavy cavalry. Why, again, the West should have not had, doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? We see it, we know it, we understand from the same capitularies that cavalry was central, that you needed as war horses. What do you think they needed them for? Even regardless of how you want to count this and how many they were, this is not a matter of numbers, this is a matter of functionality. And that's what people that focus too much on socioeconomics do not fundamentally understand about political and military history. Frankish equestrian skills earned, by the way, high regard in Western Europe as well. And also the following centuries, we see the Westerners going outside a bit more, so to say, definitely show us the superiority of Western cavalry. So this was surely not made in a couple of centuries by chance, for no reason. Merovingians had passed down late Roman stud farms managed by their comes stabuli, the constable, now accessible to Carolingian heirs. Oversight of horses from these Roman legacies fell to the comes stabuli. Early Carolingian riders made likely scarce use of stirrups, despite Avar and Longbird use. Also, that is debated in the quantity. I already explained this in different videos. You can find in the top 6 comments down below. Namely, the fact that we said before, it's not like the stirrup made the cavalry, but it's the cavalrymen who increasingly needed stirrup. You can stay on horseback with hell of thighs, muscles. Again, these men had an incredible athleticism, strength, stamina. They were forged with this in the most brutal ways, psychophysically. They lived with their horses. They thought of them to be their own alter ego, together with, again, this sword and this heavenly path that could otherwise also bring you into hell. It's so well described. Like, there are beautiful passages also from the Longbird tradition of this athleticism. The Avars bring apparently this stirrup about this gradually spreads, not much because the Avars brought them in, but because paradoxically this word was gradually modernizing and secularizing. And so the idea that cavalry combat is not much just about the champion that makes this stance and is the great athlete that can stay on horseback no matter what, but because cavalry charges become ever more smashing due to their effective collective training. So you don't need too much like that level of individualistic athleticism, as opposed to sort of not to be catapulted off of the horse while you're smashing with ever increasing power, right? And And this, as you know, evolves quite much also in the following centuries. Gradually, still on the Bayeux tapestry, you see that the Normans do not uniformly use stirrups. And probably if you had asked them, is why it can be useful or not useful, but it's mostly like if they didn't, it's not because they didn't think of something so simple like a stirrup, right? They obviously were able to do what they did. Also without. No stirrups appear in period Frankish burials was because we don't really have much of those, and youths leapt into their horses in ways that, again, these were normally stunts, elders using steps to mount, as far as we understand. The Arabs also used stirrup during their incursions from Spain. They're frequently cited as pushing Carolingian shift to cavalry, but this is also wrong. Again, this was already, the Carolingians had already heavier cavalry than the Arabs. In that sense, it's automatic, a more advanced type of cavalry by definition from a strictly military point of view. And so, again, what are we even talking about? This does not mean that there would have not been sort of blends of different practices and technologies. Contemporary Arabic texts clarify Persians and Turks employed metal stirrups, but Arabs, especially the al-Andalus, the Islamic Spain, did actually not, right? Though obviously primitive leather or rope loop stirrups may have been used by some, there was the heavier metal stirrup, but it was less necessary than even probably in Carolingian warfare, where the smashing element was sort of increasing there. And so eventually, stirrups had been worn by the metal ones, by the Avars, the Magyars, and we see this especially for the elite. Also, some were shorter stirrups were used in different ways, especially from the steps from the lighter horsemen. The Vikings at some point start using them. And some Arabs and some of, say, whoever we put under the umbrella of Arabs in the following centuries, because there's lots of people there that also had barely anything to do with Arabs, is more like part of some primitive, for example, North African injection. And if you look at the more, in fact, westernized Iberian powers, like the Christians of the north, but also some mods of Arabs, you realize that, of course, heavier type of combat existed, and it was not a law that Muslims should have just sort of lighter types of stirrup or no stirrup at all. But it still means something, right? A Carolingian rider remained heavily protected and capable, even a stirrupless, and still as a very effective heavy cavalryman, for sure. Just like many other heavy cavalrymen in the rest of the picture. But again, to look at Carolingian times and say, okay, well, this cavalry was yet probably to kick off, to even start being something like that. Well, you may have been, in this sense, at least a couple of centuries late in estimate, probably even more. As we've seen, this Carolingian heavy cavalryman's gear costs remain very elevated, so probably detaching him from the rest of society. Thus, only the sovereign and local magnates, a layer church, could fund armor-mounted troops. An interesting change, because I have the Frankish cavalry probably warhorse unit type that we have to cover. So today we don't talk about mounts per se. We can think that a key shift possibly aiding heavier armor use involved greater reliance on the robust barb horse. This is true, actually, because if you look at also, William the Conqueror's horse, as you know, these breeds were widely trafficked. They came specifically from North Africa. It was already known in late Roman Europe. It was a North African breed proliferating due also to Islamic Iberian conquests, and this will remain an important hallmark also, and reminder of the intensity of context, like the fact that the military techniques were always updated to the levels of sort of the enemies. Like there was not at this point in history this great difference between anybody. For us to say, this thing that actually not exist, these people didn't actually use it, doesn't make any sense. Right? Was it even just a difference between elite and the rest? Like they all use it anyway. And so while Carolingian emphasis on mounted warfare can be absolutely in relation to the following centuries be sort of resized, like when you look at, for example, the time of Charles the Bald in the later 9th century, we know that any man affording a horse had to serve mounted, and they would. It's a moment of Viking raids, of great effort to try to upkeep a proper national force. Everything is falling apart, socially speaking. But it's clear that those who had a horse would use it for warfare, would, as we've seen before, give their horses, if they had more, to their royal retinue men, right? The Annales Fuldenses note the Franks by 891 were unaccustomed to infantry combat, apparently, which speaks volumes about the fact that it was normal for them to live on horseback as warriors in battle was to serve as such. Like, they were more than soldiers. They were now professionals on campaign. And so when we talk about the Franks here, it's a aristocratic society, talking about itself fundamentally as such, from the same elite, from the same monks that were the relatives of the same men who went out there fighting. Sometimes they were the same sort of abbots, etc. And it was completely normal. It had already been like this from centuries, right? This thing is just intensifying with unprecedented level of technical development, of elite capacity, and for all different reasons that you can check out in my Carolingian history playlist. The post-Carolingian history playlist is actually one of the most important on my channel, because it shows you also the exhaustion, in fact, of society in front of the end of the Carolingian Empire, the remolding that was happening from the bottom up, or at least from the side of these aristocrats that now were locally taking matters in their own hand. And there's all a geography, a spirituality, a theology of the warrior saint at the same time that already appears. Look at Otto of Cluny's biographical work of Gérald of Aurillac, not Gerbert, that's Sylvester the Saint later on. But it's just for telling you how deeply ingrained since ever this idea of the warrior saint really was. This is actually a pre-Frankish thing, even a pre-Roman thing. It had always been part since the Indo-European conquests of the local landscape. It was much older and archetypal than you think. Stirrup acceptance did not instantly produce Couchet-Lange's method, so there is not even a direct proportionality between the two things. This is true for many times in warfare. We tend to associate, like, ideally a video like this, people could say, this is how this guy was actually equipped, but or how he used the spear. I'm not sort of saying that, obviously, or showing it in any particular way, but you don't have to think that it all happened at the same time. There is no doubt that down the line there is a functionalization between the two things, or more things, but at the same time there are minimal changes and they already existed by some degree before, and so were also normal, and probably they would have laughed at us if anybody had posed them this kind of question. Couching allowed firm armpit weapon hold for stronger shock charges. Into the late 9th century, spears were more ideally like thrust by arm swing under overarm or two-handed sans shield, couching developing slowly. So this makes sense as a whole. It's a broader picture, and it's very important because especially these heavier horsemen had something in common with the older Contos bearers that had historically dealt with variable counterfacts, even though for a long time things would remain with a single hand. No, lances were not sort of univocally pole barges of some sort, but some cavalrymen at this point would have actually still had something like that, and not underestimating the sense of the knightly tradition that had in part remained from the same migration era and before in these eras. Such well-geared men were fairly scarce in the general population, but in the Carolingian military, not really. And even if they were the minority, in turn, they were not, in the sense, a rarity. They were actually the spearhead of the Carolingian army, right? It doesn't make any sense to think otherwise. I will make more videos showing you how this happened and how advanced equestrian culture really was, how immediate with Frankish identity it was understood. And so we can imagine all this guy. Imagine that, especially the Scola Palatina. We'll talk more about that better. This was the elite, right, with top-tier equipment. Imagine, again, like, I don't know, Byzantine Arab scale hauberks. You see this in early 9th century frescoes and gospels, such as the 9th French Gospel, manuscript 18 at the Municipal Library of Amiens. Manuscript helmets imply either artistic shorthand or ongoing Italian Byzantine tradition. This is kind of normal and obvious as Charlemagne had become Roman emperor, being crowned by the Pope himself in the Urbs. So there is all a blend of aspects, of influences. No doubt that this is not so structural as it seems. What is structural is really what is happening locally at a political and social level, and we do know that a lot of very interesting things were happening in the same way. And they're described here with, again, a tendency toward heavier cavalry, ever more pronounced, and to a point of non-return if you have an idea of at least what post-Carolingian culture really was per se, right? And so here we are, and it's very interesting, especially to have covered this unit type, because as we said at the beginning, we haven't really made so many videos about Carolingian warfare, in spite of the fact that it should be probably one of the most watched kind of content. And I should have done this earlier on. In fact, the playlist does not have so many views per se. This is kind of strange. I don't know what it is. Like here, Carolingian Empire, the playlist probably got way more views. Yep, really a lot. So in any case, these videos tend to get sort of a fair amount of views. But again, we don't have even anything specific like a historical military unit. This is the first time we cover one for the Carolingians, even though we talk about sort of lots of warfare in it. And I'm glad that we've gotten to this point. Like, I'm glad that we are sort of rounding up, like if we look at all these units and the feasibility of the videos, everything that concerns the realism, the accuracy, as far as we can bring them on Schwerpunkt. I think this is really important, and we should definitely be particularly aware what we're representing for the sake of completion. Like, this is such a crucial fundamental unit. As you understand here, the video is pretty long, but the information is definitely well deserving, and we should make definitely more kind of this videos, foundational videos, right? So as you know where to search on my channel. You can also help yourself with the top fix comment down below. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.